All right, welcome everyone. As your Zoom links go live, we'll be getting started in just a minute or two. But we're so glad to have you here tonight for our last lecture of the fall semester. I'll be giving the formal introductions in a moment, but I want to just remind everyone that we're going to have Erika take questions at the end. I'd like to invite you to, during the talk, if a question occurs to you, use the Q&A button at the bottom of Zoom. And that when you ask a question, I'll see it. And in the Q&A section, I'll be able to promote you up to being a panelist so you can ask your question as close as in person as we get nowadays. And then I will bounce you back down to being an attendee so Erika can answer you. So just feel free to add your questions whenever they occur to you, including during the talk. And then I'll be able to see them and call on you at the end. All right. I'm going to give the stragglers a last minute or two to come on in. But we're so glad to see you guys. It's been a really wonderful slate of lectures and a really wonderful set of questions. I'm looking forward both to Erika's remarks and to your own questions and her responses, which is always my favorite part of a talk. All right, so as people file in, I just want to give her a brief reminder or an introduction if this is your first Aquinas event to what we do here. I'm Leah Sargent. I work at the Aquinas Institute. And here at Aquinas, we're the Catholic ministry at Princeton. We're here to support Catholic students and anyone who's part of the university community who's at least interested in Catholicism. Everyone's welcome at lectures like this in our seminars, and you're welcome at Eucharistic adoration too. And we'd hope that you would come to make it a habit. So, throughout the year, we have small groups, we have seminars, we have student-led prayer throughout the day. We've just wrapped up a semester of seminars, and this, with our last lecture, we'll wrap up our lectures for the semester. But we're really looking forward to planning for next term. We have a Google form where you can nominate speakers or topics for next semester's programming. We're looking forward to learning more about your thoughts and the needs that we can meet. And of course, like all the rest of you, we're really looking forward to learning what Princeton's plans are for next semester. We don't know anything that you guys don't know, but we're looking forward to learning what that decision will be in the first week of December. And as we close out the year liturgically, we're excited to have Father Zach open the new liturgical year in December with a series of meditations for Advent. And you'll be seeing more information about how to sign up to get his daily meditations throughout the season of Advent as we prepare for Christmas. And as we remember that Advent is a penitential season, it may feel like that's more salient this year, but Father Zach will offer us a way to really enter into that season and make it a true spiritual preparation for Christmas. We're also going to have a poetry night over Zoom for the Feast of the Immaculate Conception, where you can bring Marian poems, Christmas poems, and I'm very much looking forward to seeing what you pick. But for tonight, I'm thrilled to introduce Erika Bachiochi. She's a fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center and a senior fellow at the Abigail Adams Institute, which is a sister institute to Witherspoon, which many of us know and love here at Princeton. She founded and directs the Wollstonecraft Project. She is the mother of 7 children and the co-founder of the Benedict Classical Academy. Her newest book, The Rights of Women, Reclaiming a Lost Vision, is forthcoming from Notre Dame University Press in 2021. And I can say that I've just personally been thrilled to see Erika's voice really lifted up over the last few weeks in a lot of discussion about the dignity of women and the place of women that's been sparked by the nomination of Amy Coney Barrett to the Supreme Court. But I know Erika's been doing great work on this subject for years. I'm glad that, a momentary political story has kind of catapulted her up so that more and more people are hearing her thoughts. And I hope she has a really sustained place in that discussion. She's certainly been a big help to me. So with that, Erika, we're so happy to have you.
Thank you so much, Leah. It's really great to be with you all, albeit virtually. Someday we'll all see each other once again. So tonight I want to tell you a bit about my own conversion from pro-choice feminist activist in college, and then get a bit into how I think about women's rights today. To tell you that I'm a child of divorce, actually my mother was thrice divorced, and that I had some early trouble with drugs and alcohol and all that goes with that for a 14, 15, and 16-year-old girl that I ended up as a leader of the Women's Center at Middlebury College and volunteered for Bernie Sanders some 25 years ago probably isn't so surprising to any of you, especially these days. What is more interesting, perhaps, is how I came to be pro-life and then eventually a faithful Catholic. So I owe the first movements of my soul to the deep sufferings I endured when not one, but two of my close high school friends took their own lives. That period of grief and the new sense of introspection that accompanied it led for a time to a kind of new age spirituality and then into 12-step meetings where I first learned in earnest to pray. And all that, thanks be to God, inspired me to stop acting out in self-defeating ways, to be at 17 years old, both sober and chaste. That effort in itself, which became far more difficult as I entered college as a collegiate athlete, sent me still deeper into daily prayer, deeper into working the 12 steps, and deeper into the desire to really transform my life, to put it on more solid footing. Yet this deep longing for more in life sent me not to church, but to my college's women's center. The 12 steps had given me a time-tested guide for living, but had not provided me a means to understand my life as a whole in either historical or philosophical context. As one who was no longer satisfied with the prevailing culture of sex, drugs, and rock and roll, a countercultural worldview is something I really craved by the time I got to college. Secular feminists, both in the Women's Center and in the women's studies classes in which I enrolled, provided just this: a complex and compelling narrative that even offered reasons for my own inner turmoil and much else that I'd experienced in life thus far. After all, apart from the tenets of secular feminism, I had yet to encounter any philosophy that could explain my discomfort in my own body, my mistrust of men, my competitive animosity toward other women. And the feminists on campus were also the only ones I'd met who seemed to care more about real life issues like social justice for the poor and gender inequality than about parties and fraternities. And of course, the feminists were pro-choice. Thus, early on in college, the pro-choice reflexes I had as a teen were transformed into pro-choice arguments. This, despite the fact that my support for abortion as a teen had amounted to an escape hatch for a sexual permissiveness I no longer practiced nor believed in by the time I arrived at college. Now my pro-choice views were solely and firmly ensconced in feminist rationales. And so for about 2 years, I bathed in academic feminism, especially of the socialist variety. So I did not begin to question my adherence to these pro-choice feminist tenets until my junior year in college. The chief difficulty I first had with abortion concerned the role it played in the lives of poor women, or the role it seemed to me that women's groups like the National Organization for Women thought it should play. I had been studying in Washington, D.C. during a semester of my junior year and interning with a small think tank that assisted state legislatures in their efforts to reform welfare. As I became more and more immersed with the problems of the poor, especially poor women, I grew more and more disgusted with the argument put forth by abortion advocates that the availability of abortion would assist women on the road out of poverty. The thought that we as a nation would attempt to solve the problems of the poor by helping them rid themselves of their own children began to haunt me. It especially offended me that the poor were not among the membership of the elitist women's groups that supposedly spoke for them. But of course, those who first lobbied for permissive abortion laws in our country did so precisely because abortion provided a means to manage the burden the poor placed on the rest of society. Justice Harry Blackmun, the author of the court's opinion in Roe v. Wade, epitomized this tragic view in the 1977 Supreme Court case, Beal versus Doe. In that case, Blackmun dissented from the majority's refusal to require taxpayers to fund abortions. Blackmun wrote that the cost of elective abortion is, quote, far less than the cost of maternity care and delivery, and holds no comparison whatsoever with the welfare costs that will burden the state for the new indigents and their support in the long, long years ahead. And so without taxpayer funding of abortion for the poor, Blackmun said, the cancer of poverty will continue to grow. opposite this seemingly widespread view, which was especially prevalent during the Clinton years and debates over welfare reform, which is when I was down in DC, sat Harvard Law professor Mary Ann Glendon's book, Rights Talk. My politics professor in DC, a man obviously enamored with the communitarian movement of the 1990s, had assigned Glendon's book to read alongside books by Michael Sandel, Amartya Etzioni, and Robert Putnam, among others. Reading Glendon's masterpiece was the first time I'd ever heard articulated the pro-life, pro-woman, pro-poor alternative to Blackman's view, though that was not the main purpose of Rights Talk really at all. Rather than offer mere legal autonomy to the pregnant woman in crisis, the right to rid herself of her child, Glendon suggested that a real community would go out to meet her needs and offer her the counsel, assistance, and support she needed to be able to fulfill her duties to her child. It would also think long and hard about the familial and social conditions that put her in this position in the first place. Glendon's beautiful prose cast within my wounded and now prayerful and searching heart opened the same to something new. This way, the pro-life way, I could then see was far more difficult and certainly more time intensive. But I sensed strongly then and there that it was true. Authentic compassion was not sending a woman away to fix her problem alone. It was suffering alongside her, meeting her eyes, her heart. I knew this to be true despite all my pro choice training because of the suffering that I'd endured and the way so many in my 12 step meetings had stopped their busy lives, inconvenienced themselves, and taken the time, made the real sacrifice to love me. In their love, which reflected God's own self sacrificial love, I had begun to find healing. So, returning to Middlebury College with new views on the issue of abortion and economics and politics to some extent too, I changed my major to political science and dropped women's studies entirely so that I could continue my study of political philosophy. As fortune would have it, the professors into whose hands I would fall had been students of the great 20th century political philosopher Leo Strauss. They introduced me for the first time to Plato and Aristotle and so many others. And just as importantly, they taught me to read texts with great care, seriousness, and humility. The close study of classic texts of the Western tradition, along with religious intuitions that had been growing and suppressed and growing within, caused an epiphany of sorts regarding the subject of truth. I came to regard what was true about me, about the physical and metaphysical makeup of the universe, about reality to be more important than what I felt or wanted the truth to be. And with this step, and no more time tonight for any other details, I was well on my way home. One of the early troubles I'd had with women's studies, even before I'd left for DC, was the tight linkage between the feminist quest for freedom and equality and the libertine philosophy of the sexual revolution. In my experience, so called free love was, for women at least, never free. It wasn't only that women and men could engage in the same sexual act and that women, but not men, could end up pregnant. It was also that the girls and women I knew, myself very much included, were so much more emotionally affected by the hookup culture than men seem to be. I knew from personal experience that being equally autonomous, that is, equally a law unto oneself, liberated from any higher governing norms, was not real freedom or real equality either. Such an approach seemed simply to fortify power in the hands of the strong. And so, as I grew in self knowledge and discovered the real interior peace and freedom of a child of God, I wanted to understand philosophically just how modern feminism had seemed to me had been so well intentioned, but had gotten so much wrong. So the issues of freedom and equality animated my study after I left college, both in graduate studies and theology, but then in law school and my continued work in political philosophy. Though I've been deeply formed by and am truly grateful for the guiding principles of Catholic social doctrine, I've wanted to make sense of things in a way that would satisfy my feminist sensibilities too. My lifelong sense that justice demands an affirmative cultural response to reproductive asymmetry, the basic fact of life that women carry disproportionate burdens due to our special role in human reproduction. To celebrate women's distinctive responsibility is a great good, but to truly support it and share in its burdens is to me a point of justice. The church, especially the pontificate of John Paul II, has of course said something like this too, but it is needed to be more fleshed out. And so, with the guidance of Marianne Glendon's truly inspired scholarly work and that of 18th century philosopher Mary Wollstonecraft, I've come to see that the modern and very just quest for political and civil freedom and equality, for women's rights and even reproductive justice, only makes sense when built upon a pre-modern understanding of the human person and so of human freedom rightly understood, one which appreciates that the authentic goal of freedom is human excellence in all arenas of life. In a word, rights are not freewheeling tools of self expression or grabs for power in a dog eat dog world. Rather, rights are properly the civil and political apparatus born of the natural duties we owe to one another. So let me now turn to the theme of freedom by quoting from a famous speech of one of our country's greatest jurists, Judge Leonard Hand, so that we can look at how Hand's view of freedom, which is a really nice encapsulation of Wollstonecraft's and Glendon's and the pre-moderns too, differs from our own day's consumerist account, and then how the latter has really corrupted the modern day cause for women's rights. I'll then end by sketching what I mean by a dignitarian feminism, and then finally ask for your questions. So here's a portion of Hand's Spirit of Liberty speech, which he delivered to 150,000 newly naturalized citizens in 1944. Liberty lies in the hearts of men and women. When it dies there, no constitution, no law, no court can save it. He then asks, what is this liberty which must lie in the hearts of men and women? And he answers, it is not the ruthless, the unbridled will. It is not freedom to do as one likes. This is the denial of liberty and leads straight to its overthrow. A society in which men recognize no check upon their freedom soon becomes a society where freedom is the possession of only a savage few. Freedom, Hand tells us, is not only an abstract principle to be protected and promoted as we often think about it today. It is also a concrete practice in the hearts of men and women that requires a certain personal and societal discipline, some check on our desires and preferences. True freedom and its political variant, self government, presupposes self government of the personal variety, or as the ancients called it, virtue or human excellence. As Wollstonecraft herself aptly summarized the small r Republican understanding of her time, one shared by many of our country's founders as well, society can only be happy and free in proportion as it is virtuous. And yet, since Hand's time, US culture has become more and more defined by an enormous degree of consumer choice, and this has seemed to shape our view of choice in other areas too. It might, it might well be said that the ancient view of freedom has been traded in increasingly for the kind of freedom ostensibly delivered by the market, the freedom to choose among one's preferences. A real woman with myriad needs and desires, a pornographic image, or a sex doll, which will do. The market seems not to take a position. The putatively autonomous consumer is now free to choose. Scarcely contemplated in this new consumerist approach to freedom is its proper use and end, that most important question of a prior age. As Harvard philosopher Michael Sandel has put it, without quite realizing it, without ever deciding to do so, we drifted from having a market economy to being a market society. He continues, a market economy is a tool, a valuable and effective tool for organizing productive activity. A market society is a way of life in which market values seep into every aspect of human endeavor. It's a place where social relations are made over in the image of the market. As I show in my forthcoming book, The Rights of Women, the women's movement of the 19th century, which was deeply influenced by Wollstonecraft's thought, worked hard to resist the powerful draw of market values in the personal lives of men, women, and children. As Tocqueville himself noticed, American women recognized early on that the most good, true, and beautiful things in life would never be counted in the growing commercial economy nor valued by a wage. Indeed, they foresaw clearly that the character shaping, solidarity building work they did with their husbands and their homes, raising up new generations of Americans in the virtues of collaboration, reciprocity, trust, and concern for others, could be undermined by the materialistic tendencies of the new commercial economy, even as these virtues make such an economy viable and sustainable in the first place. Through their political advocacy for joint property ownership, suffrage, and more, the early women's rights advocates sought to elevate legally and politically the essential work of the home, that person oriented island in a market driven sea. In the last half century, that traditional resistance to the encroaching logic of the consumerist market has withered, and more often than not, feminism too has ceded to its worldview. Today, the women's movement on the whole promotes a view of freedom as autonomous choice, manifest most plainly in the popular abortion rights slogan, right to choose. In this dominant choice framework, parenthood is increasingly viewed as one lifestyle choice among many, and for mothers, an opportunity cost at that. The value of children and other dependents are too often subject, like other trade offs in the marketplace, to individual or social cost benefit analysis. The women's movement of the last 50 years has made extraordinary gains, not the least of which is the recognition of women as individual persons equal under the law. The myriad and diverse capacities, interests, and abilities of women, especially as opportunities have become increasingly available to them, know no end. The modern day women's movement can be credited with at last putting to rest the ways in which women's unequal legal status in the family and in society had subordinated women unjustly for too long. But the women's movement today has been slower to recognize that abstract rights only take women so far. Taken to their limit as the freedom of the autonomous will or the mere power to choose, abstract rights tend to eat away at the very concrete preconditions that make their exercise worthwhile and humane. It can be said that the very philosophical and legal revolution that inspired women's enhanced legal status in the family and in society, recognizing women as individuals with civil and political rights of their own, has also tended to upend age-old support structures that traditionally had provided women the solidarity they needed to undertake their familial and communal responsibilities. After all, the expectation of lifelong marriage in tandem with the day-to-day support of multi-generational families and close-knit communities had softened the ever-present trials of caregiving while providing the joys and close bonds of friendship too. And so these kinds of considerations, most notably our shared responsibilities to the vulnerable and dependent, have been subordinated to the duly unencumbered autonomous self so prized in the good life of our late modern capitalist society. And that consuming, choosing, disembodied self makes no room for the concrete asymmetries inherent in sexual intercourse and reproduction, and in caregiving too. The deck is stacked today against pregnant women and caregiving families, the very people to whom future generations will owe their existence and well being. And so, without a substantive account of human freedom and its proper end, human excellence, the essential human goods of children, family, and community, so necessary for authentic human flourishing, are subordinated to the dominant value of choice dictated by the logic of the market. We're left with a culture that aggrandizes consumerism, workaholism, and the relentless quest for power, wealth, and pleasure. And though this new American way of life may appear to benefit the rich, well educated, and otherwise privileged, none of this bodes well for children and other vulnerable populations. Women's rights are no different. Without an account of what freedom is for, feminism ends up appropriating a market orientation too. Individual choice is to be maximized without an obvious limiting principle and without due consideration of the apparent goods that are being chosen. As a consequence, the modern day women's movement on the whole has difficulty condemning epidemic pornography and other forms of sexual exploitation from sex work to now normative casual sex. It insists on retaining consent as the highest value in the sexual context, even as asymmetrical power disparities rightly put the concept of consent into question in other arenas. And as increasing numbers of ordinary women lament today's male oriented sexual norms. More still, the movement possesses little means beyond the econometric to articulate why caregivers ought to enjoy public support or why workplaces should be family friendly. In the now dominant logic of the market, marriage, children, and caregiving, human goods that have been affirmed and celebrated throughout human history, are treated as merely individual preference with substantial financial consequences. Rendered private goods mediated by private choices, the inherent public nature of these goods and the communal and political responsibilities they entail is widely forgotten. The wealthy are scarcely affected by such cultural amnesia, as the majority persist in living out relatively family centered lives. But the poor are shorn of that essential familial and communal substructure upon which they might find their own footing and rise above their circumstances. As a result, the women's movement, like modern culture as a whole, is bereft of a language with which to celebrate beautiful marriages like Ruth Bader Ginsburg's, or to offer those relationships as worthy of emulation by rich and poor alike. If we dare call sexual integrity, faithful marriage, or devoted parenting what they are, manifestations of human excellence that cohere with human flourishing, we render a moral judgment we moderns are no longer supposed to make. And yet we happily make such evaluative assessments on less consequential human activities all the time. In our celebration of talented athletes and musicians, scientists, and entrepreneurs, we are affirming human excellence and implicitly the self discipline needed to achieve it. And so, why not affirm such excellence in what matters far more to our children and our future? The tireless work we do in our marriages and in our families. And why not demand that our workplaces, the epicenter of the capitalistic ethic, affirm these human goods too? Wollstonecraft argued more than 200 years ago that civil and political rights would enable women and men to strive for human excellence. Such excellence would be achieved, she thought, by fulfilling the day to day responsibilities one had to God, self, family, and society, whatever one's current station, or we might say now, season in life. To affirm the highest good in human endeavors is not to disparage those who do not reach its ideals. A true love of humanity holds up the highest ideals for emulation, while recognizing the propensity of all of us to fall short, and thus need assistance, understanding, and often a fresh start to begin again. For Wollstonecraft, it was precisely the shared human capacity to strive for human excellence, whatever one's starting point, that gave human beings their equal human dignity amidst manifold diversity in natural talents, individual responsibilities, and human achievement. Feminism can be reimagined today with this ennobling moral vision in mind. Such a feminism, a dignitarian feminism, to employ a term Glendon once used, would first defend the native or basic dignity of every human being, whose very nature, qua human being, provides the surest foundation for human rights. But it would also promote a second, higher sense of dignity, borrowed from the ancients and extolled by Wollstonecraft and Glendon too. Dignitas, or the honor and nobility found not in high social status, but in living human life excellently. If a freedom without virtue would reduce men to beasts, as Wollstonecraft put it, a freedom for excellence would work to empower human beings to live according to their great dignity by supporting them as they seek to fulfill their myriad responsibilities in life. In such an account of human flourishing, where the virtuous fulfillment of our responsibilities and duties of care take center stage, the work of human formation would finally get the promotion it deserves. After all, the formative work of the family, shaping and enlivening the culture of the home, nurturing trust and solidarity, instilling lifelong virtues, incarnates a commitment to society of the very greatest sort. For the habits learned and practiced in the home for both children and parents alike carry well beyond the home into the broader community, the workplace, and the public square. Virtue is, of course, learned little by little, practiced in the daily obligations and circumstances of life through the nurture and guidance of a community that seeks to encourage each person's authentic development. And the first community is, of course, that of the family. Though we often don't think of it this way, justice is really the primary or most fundamental virtue that governs relationships between children and parents. You'll remember that for the ancients, justice demands that we give each person his or her due. Justice is, of course, the rightful end of any political regime, today often rendered social justice, but it is a personal virtue too. Political and social justice presuppose that individuals act justly in their personal and professional relations. Judges carry out their duties with impartiality. Employers offer just wages. Spouses treat each other with the equal dignity each is due. Indeed, a just regime cannot come into being without an abundance of just individuals. And like the other virtues, justice is experienced and learned first in the family, or only with great difficulty later in life. Parents owe duties of care to their dependent children precisely because of the existential dependency relationship that exists between them. And when parents age, children in justice owe their now dependent parents a reciprocal duty of care. Young children depend upon parents not only for meeting their material needs, but also to provide the nurturing and loving environment, moral guidance, and good example by which they can develop the virtues needed to become mature, benevolent, and happy adults. So we can say that in the parent-child relations, vulnerability begets responsibility. And so the more vulnerable the child, the more injustice that child is due. As Wollstonecraft well understood, individual rights flow from these natural duties. Children have a right and justice to that which is due them. Parents likewise enjoy the right to carry out their duties to their children. Good societies ordered to the full flourishing of human beings properly recognize and protect both. This affirmative duty of parental care is first shared by biological mothers and fathers because in ordinary circumstances, they are uniquely situated to meet the needs of their vulnerable children. And in exercising these duties well, with the daily perseverance, patience, and ingenuity parenting requires, biological and adoptive mothers and fathers exhibit a human excellence that is worthy of social praise and emulation. But of course, maternal and paternal duties differ and give way to what I called earlier a reproductive asymmetry. It is, after all, women and not men who carry and bear children. There is much to say about this, in fact, a whole book's worth. But let me just say this. When we culturally and legally belittle the moral status of the embryo or fetus, an unrepeatable human being just like us, though rudimentary in size and form, treating the young one as something foreign, non-human, or parasitic upon a pregnant woman, we are also belittling the state of pregnancy itself and so too each and every pregnant woman. If pregnancy continues to be likened to any other lifestyle choice or medical condition, or worse, a disability in a Hobbesian contest with wombless men, pregnant women will never receive the cultural esteem and support they, in justice, are due. Their affirmative choice or voluntary consent to continue their pregnancies will be regarded as akin to all other choices in the now hegemonic market frame of reference, a private assumption of a burden that is theirs alone to carry and a benefit that they alone might enjoy. Of course, we ordinarily do not think of dependent children and their developmental needs as choices to which we must consent, nor do we regard human beings as private goods we may choose to enjoy. Rather, human beings are endowed with an intrinsic dignity that cannot, indeed ought not be degraded by cost benefit analysis, nor affirmed existentially by another's choice. Indeed, our formative relationships, in the family especially, involve obligations of an involuntary sort all the time. The family, after all, as historian Alan Carlson writes, is, quote, necessarily organized on non-market principles. The family alone can successfully embody the socialist principle, from each according to his ability, to each according to his need, end quote. And so respecting the non-market norms and values of these most intimate human relationships and the duties of mutual care and concern they imply provides the surest defense against a complete commercialization of all of human life and assures, too, the kind of life that is worth living at all. Only by reestablishing the inherent dignity and value of each human being, that moral proposition to which our country has ever been called, will pregnant women and caregiving families receive the public support and commendation they in justice deserve. For the cultural value of their caregiving depends unavoidably upon recognizing the incalculable value of the vulnerable and dependent human beings in their care. On authentic reproductive justice, then, would not only ask expectant mothers in ordinary circumstances to offer their developing unborn children due care. It goes without saying, well, to this group anyway, that fathers must take up their shared duties of care toward both mother and child, too. But for an authentic justice to prevail in our time, more than that is needed still. It is high time that the work of the family be given the cultural respect, attention, and assistance it deserves. A dignitarian feminism, a feminism for excellence, would thus promote the view that the culturally essential duties undertaken in the home properly underlie all our civil and political rights and privileges, and thereby provide the preconditions for our economic, political, and civil life together. And with that understanding in view, we just might be able to vindicate the equality of the sexes the way Wollstonecraft once did. Men and women share equally in the human capacity for excellence, but that excellence is most manifest not in our value to the market economy, whatever the diversity of our daily labors. Rather, it is best practiced and achieved in the shared and reciprocal responsibilities we undertake as mothers and fathers, sons and daughters, sisters and brothers, citizens, colleagues, and friends. As Wollstonecraft put it most poignantly, society is not properly organized, which does not compel men and women to discharge their respective duties. Today, these duties might be best compelled were they but better recognized, prioritized, supported, and shared. Thank you so much.
Oh, it is our pleasure, Erika. And I see questions are coming on in. So I'm going to, well, it looks like some of the questions are anonymous. So I'm going to pass off one of the anonymous questions. And then Helena, you'll be up next to be boosted up to be a panelist to ask your question. But for one of the students who would like to ask this question anonymously, as a Catholic feminist, can you speak to the male priesthood of the church? I imagine this is a question that comes up for a lot of folks here, and people may feel unsure how to articulate it.
Sure. So, it's funny. I can send you to a great source, actually two great sources where real experts or one real expert can, I think, answer that best. and that is, well, the book I edited, Women, Sex, and the Church, A Case for Catholic Teaching. So Sister Sarah Butler was actually one of the, I think she was the head of the Catholic Theological Association, so that's the head of all theologians in America. And she was very much for women in the priesthood, and her bishop asked her to study it, and she did for a long period of time. And she actually came to appreciate and then agree with the church's teaching. So I want to send you to that chapter. I bet there in that library somewhere in the Aquinas Institute is that book, Women, Sex, and the Church. And if it's not, we can get you a copy. But I think that chapter is a great one. She also has a book entitled Women and the Catholic Priesthood. I think it's a very, very complex question. It's not an easy one. And so I don't want to, give you, I'm not a sound bite time type of gal. And so I think, some will look at sort of feminine and masculine difference. I think what she does is not look at that. She says that that's sort of a theological explanation that one could use. But she especially does look at the act of Jesus himself in choosing 12 apostles, despite having very, very close and potentially, closer female friends and disciples. And then also the unbroken line of tradition apostolically. I think it's really good, though, that if you're interested in this, it's a stumbling block for so many people. The last thing I'll say, and I always go too far in answering questions, and I don't want to do that. But the last thing I'll say is when I started studying theology, it was a big question for me. I went to my professor, who is actually bedridden, and it was very sad because he's one of the great intellectual heroes of my life, Ernest Horton. And I said to him, why can't women be priests? And he said, because there would be no men left on the altar. And so I think there's just sort of a sociological insight there that women, in our great ability at multitasking and doing sort of everything, sort of take over everything all the time. And I think you see this in Protestant denominations where women really have taken over, not so, but they've really become the majority of ministers. I think, I don't know if that's true, actually, the majority, but there are many, many women ministers. And so to keep men in church, it would be nice to have some men on the altar. So that's sort of maybe a pithy kind of answer at the end there. But thanks for the question, and really do study it because it's a remarkably complex question and an important one to study.
Yeah, I really appreciate the book recommendation, which we'll certainly double check and see if we have it at Aquinas, and if not, we'll have the Erika shelf of all the books you recommend during Q&A.
Great.
But I think the other thing that comes up for me when I get this question from non-Catholics is there's a real earned skepticism people have of any institution that excludes women. There are theological reasons for the male priesthood. I don't think there are as strong ontological reasons for women not being allowed to play golf at Augusta, right? And when people keep running into kind of unjust exclusions of women, it's reasonable they kind of run into every new one and by default assume it's unjust. But one thing I found really helpful for anyone kind of having this conversation with a friend who isn't Catholic is I find that it's not just that my friend is in favor of women priests, it's that my friend doesn't believe in priests. Because what is a priest? A priest is someone who has the ability to perform the sacraments, who has been given this responsibility and this gift. But if my friend isn't Catholic and doesn't believe that Christ, is in the Eucharist, a priest is a worship leader and someone who gives homilies. But that's not what we believe priests to be. And as long as we're kind of stuck at that level, it's really a question of why aren't there any women unicorns? Because my friend is talking about a category they fundamentally doesn't believe exist.
And this is why Leah's working at the Aquinas Institute. That was beautiful. Thank you so much.
All right, I've got Helena coming up to join us as a panelist. So in just a moment. There we go. Helena, go ahead and ask your question.
Hi, Helena.
Hi, sorry, my camera's not working, so I can't turn the camera on. But I was wondering about how we begin to redefine feminism in an era where it is really deeply entrenched with the pro-choice movement, and it almost seems irreversibly tied to that. So I guess because it's so deeply entrenched in our culture, what can we do on a daily basis or even on a larger scale, just any way that we can kind of challenge that notion of what equality means and what feminism means?
Yeah, and I think that's the best question after my talk is like, okay, how could you possibly, you and your little book and a couple other Leahs, doing some things and some other people try to, reappropriate feminism. Good luck, lady. So that's a great question, Helena. I appreciate it. And, my effort is really, I mean, there's, so many different things I'm trying to do. One of them is really be in conversation with pro-choice feminists because, since coming into the church, I really believe that we have to be in conversation with feminism because of how effective feminism has been over the course of the last 50 years. It has really changed everything. And so what my book does is really separate the wheat from the chaff, going through sort of, it's an intellectual history of women's rights. And so there's places I very much am in agreement. There's an entire chapter on Ruth Bader Ginsburg's 1970s advocacy, sex discrimination advocacy. So, and I, very laudatory of her there. So, I think there's ways in which we can do that because a lot of people just see, say, especially of a woman Catholic, but a pro-lifer as just being a traditionalist. And I'm not a traditionalist. I mean, I have 7 children and I, live a traditional life in many ways, but I'm not a traditionalist. I do believe that women, ought to have civil and political rights and are equal to men. And so I think that kind of it's basically like giving a rationale that's not yet there, and it's putting myself out there. In fact, what's been great is that you think you're not going to be heard, and here I am. I was pretty much a stay-at-home mom, typing out a law review article on equality arguments for abortion rights, and that article, which got into the Harvard Journal of Law and Public Policy, is taught now in Reva Siegel's, I don't know if she still teaches, but Yale law professor Reva Siegel, she's the most well-known pro-choice law professor in the country, really. I mean, Ruth Bader Ginsburg used to quote her in her dissents, etc. So she would, so we need to be making the arguments so that there is an alternative, not only so that, pro-choicers may actually pay attention to it. Reva and I are both keynoting an upcoming Columbia event, which is basically pro-choice and pro-life feminists coming together to talk about, not so much is there common ground, like lowering down our principles, not at all, but there are things we do agree on. So, care work and those types of things, there's plenty that we agree on, pregnancy discrimination, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But I think it's making our voices known and elevating, I guess I don't use this term in my book, but it's kind of a maternalist feminist voice that was thoroughgoing up until 1970. I mean, this was the way women's rights were conceived. So it's, bringing that to light so that people can't say things to like new wave feminists, like you're not a feminist because you're pro-life. It's just not true. And my view is that you can stand, the foundation for women's rights is so much more solid when it's set upon the foundation that I set out for it in the book, because historically, that's what was the case, but then also philosophically, it's just much more robust. So, these things take time. I mean, but there's already so much fomenting in our culture right now. There's so much realignment that like, let's go, let's do it. I'm ready. Leah's ready. I can see her nodding. Let's go. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot to do. You didn't ask that question though, Helena. Sorry, you asked about day-to-day experience. So what do? We treat each other with charity and love, I mean, I think living, here I am talking to Catholic Center, so living an authentic, beautiful Catholic life and treating your brothers and sisters with great love and compassion and going out to the margins, as our Holy Father has been saying, meeting them, getting to know people, really listening, learning from them, from all sorts of people you disagree with. Do it, do that. And that's how you can really start to bring people into the conversation. And read, pray and read, pray and read.
We have St. Augustine speaking through you there.
I don't know about that, but thank you.
And we have a request in through the Q&A for a link to the Columbia event you've mentioned. If you can drop that into the chat.
I'll send that. To the chat. You know what? There isn't a link yet. So what you can do is, well, if you follow me on Twitter, which doesn't get you anything because I don't have enough Twitter followers. If you follow Leah on Twitter, I'll send it to her. She'll repost it. But it's coming up in March. It actually was put off for a whole year. So it'll be in March and it will be on Zoom, unfortunately. But it's the end of March, I think the 25th. And it should be great. I'm really looking forward to it. So we'll try to get you the information.
I'm I'm going to ask a quick follow-up for Helena's question, which is, when do we out ourselves as pro-life or dignitarian feminists when we are making common cause? I think the Women's March was a tough moment where, some real dignitarian feminist groups, like you mentioned, the New Wave feminists, wanted to affiliate to advocate for women and were booted as organizational groups.
Yeah.
Now, of course, no one said technically that pro-life women were not allowed to attend personally, and no one stood at the gates of the mall, which don't exist, to kind of question everyone as they entered. Are you in fact pro-life? Are you here to support women, but also are you pro-life? But the kicking out of the New Wave feminists meant a lot of the women I know who wanted to attend felt like they suddenly had to decide whether their sign had to be about being present as a pro-life feminist,
Yeah.
or if they were going for a sign, could they highlight something else? If a Catholic is working with a group that, a group I support is a prison doula project who supports pregnant women in prison and gives them the support they need in a system that's often profoundly unjust to them, pregnant or not. When do I, if I'm donating or fundraising for them, go, and by the way, I'm pro-life? How do you navigate that?
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I don't, I'm not sure when you would bring it up, but I think, I don't know that you'd bring it up at all, really. I mean, I don't think, although having a sign that's pro-life at a big march like that is probably great, although you may be pushed to the edge. I think that that's something that is a natural one-on-one kind of thing. I mean, it obviously is wonderful when you see a big group of pro-life people and they're, we're here and all of that. But it seems to me that hearts and minds are just like mine was, certainly. I mean, the story I didn't tell was when Helen Alvarez, who was then with the bishop, she's a George Mason law professor now, but she was with the bishop's communicator, and she came into our class in DC, and there was a pro-choice woman and a pro-life woman. And there was Helen, and they came on separate days. And Helen was this like lovely, wonderful human being. And I have no idea what she said, but it was so attractive to me that I listened and opened my ears. And when the woman came in who was pro-choice, she was quite awful. And that's all I remember. That's all I remember. And just that we know that is that, it may be that someone learns down the line that we're pro-life. And then they think back to all of those interactions they've had with us as a friend, that we've been a friend to them. That is so much better than, whether it's you're holding up the sign or whatever it is. So I think it's always going to be one-on-one or in groups like this that we're going to be most effective.
I have another anonymous question from a student who would like to know a little more about what you see as the role and responsibility of men in creating a society that supports this view of feminism. You
Yes.
feel about just living up to basic responsibilities as fathers, but going beyond that, which I hope everyone on this Zoom call is planning to do if and when it occurs. What should men do to lift up women?
Yeah, that's great. I mean, we obviously could look at, Jesse Barrett and say, wow, look at that guy. I mean, just kind of amazing, like taking on so much. I mean, I think as a Catholic man, I have to tell you that for all those Catholic men out there, when I came to meet Catholic men, I was amazed at how much more emotionally present, attentive, egalitarian. I mean, you name it, they were than any feminist man I'd met or liberal leaning man I'd met before. I shouldn't say liberal leaning, but progressive or whatever it was at Middlebury. So I really have just found men of faith to just be outstanding individuals. So there's that. But I think too, I mean, it's just it's the discernment process, in marriage, certainly. Obviously, Leah and Alexia are great, representative of this, watching right before our eyes. But I think too, in the world, I mean, I think it's really talking a lot about fatherhood. It's elevating fatherhood so that it's a constitutive part of, so you see that it constitutes a man in the way that, motherhood we just kind of know culturally or did. And now, it's, you don't want to talk about. If we were all talking about our children in the workplace, wouldn't that be wonderful? And so it's really elevating that kind of language, men talking about their families, talking about their children, talking about those kinds of things, because they do. I mean, at least the Catholic men I know, that's the most important work they do, whether they be lawyers or whatever they are. It's the most important work they have is with their marriage and with their children, because they understand how enormous, the undertaking is for themselves, for obviously their whole life, and for the world. So I remember that a very, very successful man, got up at a conference. It was a business conference I was speaking at. He got up and he was talking about all sorts of things. And he said, these men would come, young men would come in for him asking advice about this and that and business and that. And he said to them, do you want to be a father? Do you want to be a husband? And when he was telling us, recounting this to us, the entire room got up and gave him a standing ovation because he was asking those men about their future family lives. And so I think it's that kind of thing that is enormously helpful. It's just seeing that it's both of us. It's not like, women and men like rock. It's both of us saying it's like the lean into the family, I guess is the way you would put it, is because that's where it all happens. And then everything coming out, work can be enormously wonderful. I mean, I love my work, and my husband doesn't like his work. He likes his work some, but I think he's jealous of mine because it's, I'm not paying as many bills as he is for sure. But I think it's really leaning into the family and talking about that in a way, and fighting for sort of, what we need to be promoting the family, especially for the poor, frankly, is really the most important place right now.
I love that as a point. I think that's something to keep in mind, both while you're an undergraduate, to talk openly for the men, particularly about your desire for children and to be a father. Um, it's really astounding to me how rare that is to see men talk publicly about it, and possibly you're all talking about it when I'm not around. But I think it's a lot easier for women to talk openly about and plan their lives around, and it can make men feel lonely, not knowing for sure anyone else wants this in the same way. I wonder, my own, personal hobby horse is a little bit how much, the smallness of families kind of also saps a little bit people's ardor to be parents. I know that for Alexi and I, one thing that really touched me in our courtship was how much she'd already changed diapers being from a larger family and looked forward to doing it again. But I think it's easier to be frightened of children if you just haven't been around or been responsible for many of them.
That's right.
Which I guess washes out to a recommendation that you all take up babysitting.
That's right. And it's been the best thing for my boys. I have three girls in a row, and then I have three boys who are 13, 11, and 9. And we had a 2-year-old. Now we have a 2-year-old girl, but she was so far. And I mean, how great has that been for the boys? Like, if you have a problem with this like toxic masculinity, have a baby and see what boys do. I mean, it's incredible. It's been awesome.
One
The
of
big
the
family, yes, is really wonderful.
One of the attendees has sent in as more of a comment than a question, but it's a good comment, so I'll just read it out. That they're really discouraged by feeling like it's normal for women to ask each other about their kids, but unusual for men to get together with the kids not present and really catch up about their children, instead of about their job or something else. That they want that to be more of an option, going both ways. All right, and then I've got one last anonymous question, and then I think we'll close in prayer. For a dignitarian feminist, what is the vocation of women in society? There's the importance of teaching virtue within the family, but also women in the workplace. What is the appropriate balance? We're ending on an easy one, Erika.
Oh, right.
And how does the church speak about these complementary vocations between home and work?
Yeah. So I guess what I was really putting forth is just this idea of excellence. So, and virtue really in every realm. And so what that means is it's a real discernment of where each person is called. And so there's kind of an autonomy in the family between the spouses to kind of figure out what that is, that, where each spouse is called to. And that's really where, vocation comes from. I mean, I think, you're literally being called to do some certain work from God. And so that discernment process, it's really not cookie cutter. It's not the same for each family. I mean, obviously, there is the Amy Coney Barrett of the world. There's not many like her, but I do know another family, 7 children. The wife and mother is a nuclear physicist, and the husband is a history guy who homeschooled their kids. So, I know many more, and the data shows us that it's much, more women tend to want to be part-time, whether they're home, they kind of want a little bit of part-time work. Obviously, some people want to be fully at home. Some people want to be fully full-time, but a lot of people want to be part-time, want to be doing part-time work when their children are young. And I think to have that kind of capacity to go in and out of the workplace and to keep your foot in and do good part-time work would be wonderful. We need to see that kind of flexibility, I think. In terms of, promoting this. I mean, I guess I would just also put forth about a 40-minute talk I gave called Balancing Life Balance, something like that. It was at the Given Institute, and it's all about this, how the church, I think that the church gives us this kind of structure because of this idea of duties of state, that our first duty of state is, well, in our baptism, So it's to really, discernment, listening to God's word in our life, God's presence in our life, and then it's to our marriage, and then it's to our children, and then it's to any other work that we do. And so those duties of state, I think, are really helpful to sort of organize things. But anyway, so if you look up, actually, it's at the Ethics and Public Policy website under presentations. It's a talk I gave. There's a little bit of story, so you'll have to endure a little bit of that. Maybe a different part of the story, because there's all sorts of different parts. But yeah, it's a talk on work-life balance. Although I kind of throw that whole thing out. The idea of balance is absurd. And I use the idea of a ship like up at a keel. I think that's where the keel, where it's like, and grace is like the wind and you're barely holding on, but grace is what is propelling us. And I think when you're propelled by grace and you're really wanting that, most of all, you're really wanting to follow what God wants, both spouses. I mean, I think that's why picking a spouse is really important. Then these things kind of work themselves out day by day. And my work life has been all different throughout the now almost 20 years of our marriage. And it's remarkable, but God really works it out.
Thank you so much, Erika. And I'm really pleased on the note that you're ending our night on, because it does all come down to grace. That a lot of these questions about how do we act in justice towards each other, how do we recognize the individual dignity of each person, these questions can feel overwhelming, the particular duties we have, and they come down to grace and really living out our call to love others as Christ does, and making room for him to teach us how when we feel uncertain. Erika and I got ready before you came in by praying together, and we asked the Holy Spirit to come and be with her. We're going to have our closing prayer be the Anima Christi as we all prepare to go out into the world and really offer icons of what it means to be men and women in full, dignified relation to each other. There are a lot of translations, so if you want to pray along, I'm making sure to drop the translation I'm using into the chat. So, in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen. Soul of Christ, sanctify me. Body of Christ, save me. Blood of Christ, inebriate me. Water from the side of Christ, wash me. Passion of Christ, strengthen me. O good Jesus, hear me. Within thy wounds hide me. Separated from thee, let me never be. From the malignant enemy defend me. At the hour of death call me, and bid me come unto thee, that with thy saints I may praise thee forever and ever. Amen. Thank you all so much for joining us. We look forward to seeing you at other Aquinas events, and I will send on details of Erika's March event when that comes around. Most of all, just as a word of hope, the pandemic is a huge disruption to everyone's work and family life, but it also means that the next year or so is a really powerful moment to put forward alternative visions for how we build back better than what we had before. So if you felt frustrated, seeing some of the options that are open to you after graduation, or wondering about how you'll navigate this is a really potent time to hold up alternate examples. And I'm so glad we have Erika doing that. Erika, thank you so much.
Thank you, Leah. Great to be with you all.
Bye.